Danielle had always been a fan of online shopping. Our house was often filled with the crinkle of packaging tape and the faint smell of cardboard. I'd come home to find boxes stacked neatly by the door, and she'd tear them open with the enthusiasm of a child at Christmas. A new set of throw pillows here, a gadget for the kitchen there. It was harmless fun, her way of adding small joys to our life. But in the past few weeks, the deliveries had grown noticeably frequent. Not just a box here or there, but packages arriving almost daily, sometimes more than once. At first, I chalked it up to a spree of redecorating or retail therapy. But there was something else. The deliveries always seemed to arrive after I left for work, and when I asked about them, her answers were unusually vague. "Oh, just something for the house," she'd say, waving it off with a quick smile. I didn't press her. Danielle wasn't a secretive person. At least, I didn't think she was. One evening, as I walked into the kitchen, I noticed a delivery slip on the counter. It was for a package I hadn't seen, addressed to her but marked delivered. My curiosity was piqued. "What's this?" I asked, holding it up. Danielle glanced at the slip and quickly grabbed it from my hand, tucking it into her purse. "Just some office supplies," she said casually. "You wouldn't be interested." Her response was a little too quick, her laugh a touch too forced. My stomach tightened, but I forced myself to let it go. Maybe I was reading too much into it, but the nagging feeling didn't leave me. The following week, I noticed her phone habits had changed. She seemed glued to her screen, her fingers flying across the keyboard in quick, furtive motions. And whenever I walked into the room, she'd tuck her phone away or flip it face down. It wasn't like her. Danielle had always been an open book, and now she felt like a locked diary. "You've been on your phone a lot lately," I said one night as we sat on the couch. She smiled, but her expression didn't reach her eyes. "Just work stuff. They're piling on the deadlines this month." Her explanation seemed plausible, but her tone made my skin crawl. That Friday, I decided to take a half day at work. My intention was to surprise her, maybe even take her out for lunch. But there was another reason I hadn't admitted to myself yet. I wanted to see for myself what was going on during those daytime hours when I wasn't home. When I pulled into the driveway, a delivery truck was parked out front. My heart sank. The driver was standing on our porch, and Danielle was at the door, chatting with him. Her smile was bright and warm, too warm. It wasn't just friendly, it was flirtatious. I stayed in the car, watching them. She leaned forward slightly, her laugh ringing out like the peal of a bell. And then he handed her a package, their hands brushing for a moment too long. After a few minutes, I couldn't take it anymore. I stepped out of the car, the sound of the door slamming breaking their little moment. Danielle turned toward me, her expression faltering for just a second before she plastered on her usual grin. "Chris, you're home early," she said, her voice cheerful but a little too high-pitched. "Yeah," I replied, forcing a smile. "Thought I'd surprise you." The driver shifted uncomfortably, muttering something about needing to get going. Danielle handed him the package back, a strange gesture I didn't understand at the time. He tipped his cap and hurried to his truck, leaving us alone in the awkward silence. "What's going on?" I asked, my eyes narrowing. "Nothing," she said quickly, laughing nervously. "Just a delivery. You know how I love my online shopping." I didn't push further, but as I followed her inside, the tension between us was palpable. That night, I couldn't sleep. Danielle was curled up beside me, her breathing soft and steady, but my thoughts were anything but calm. I replayed the scene on the porch over and over, each time noticing something new. The way her body language shifted toward him, the easy familiarity in their exchange. Was I overthinking this? Or was there something she wasn't telling me? By morning, I'd made up my mind. I wasn't proud of it, but I decided to go through her phone. While she showered, I grabbed it from the kitchen counter, my heart pounding as I unlocked the screen. Most of the messages were ordinary, chats with friends, reminders for appointments. But one conversation stood out. The name, Mark D., caught my attention immediately. I didn't recognize it, and the messages were far from professional. "Mark D., same time tomorrow?" "Danielle, of course. Can't wait." The air felt like it had been sucked out of the room. My hands trembled as I stared at the screen, my chest tightening with each passing second. Who the hell was Mark D? And what exactly was she looking forward to? The next morning, I told Danielle I had to go into the office for an emergency meeting. She didn't question it, waving me off with her usual smile. But instead of heading to work, I parked my car a few blocks away and walked back to the house. My heart pounded with every step, dread and determination warring within me. When I reached the driveway, the delivery truck was already there. I crouched behind the fence, watching as Mark handed Danielle a package. But it wasn't just the package. He leaned closer, his hand grazing hers as he spoke. She laughed, the same laugh I'd once thought was reserved for me. I couldn't take it anymore. I burst through the front door, my face flushed with anger. Mark froze, the package slipping from his hand. Danielle's eyes widened, her smile vanishing in an instant. "Chris," she stammered, "what are you doing here?" "That's my question," I snapped, my voice shaking. "What the hell is going on here?" Mark muttered something unintelligible and bolted for the door, leaving Danielle and me alone in the suffocating silence. She looked at me, her mouth opening and closing as if searching for an excuse. But there were no words that could explain what I'd just seen. Mark's hurried retreat left a suffocating silence in the house, broken only by the sound of Danielle's shaky breathing. She looked at me, her eyes wide and filled with something that might have been fear or guilt. My own chest tightened, anger and confusion battling for control. I wanted answers, but more than that, I wanted the truth. What was that about? I asked, my voice cold and clipped. Danielle opened her mouth, but no words came out. Instead, she wrung her hands, her gaze darting toward the door as if she were hoping Mark would magically reappear and explain everything for her. "I'm waiting," I said, crossing my arms. "It's not what it looks like," she finally managed, her voice barely above a whisper. I let out a bitter laugh, the sound foreign even to my own ears. "Really? Because it looks like you were getting pretty cozy with the delivery guy." She flinched at my words, her face crumpling. "It's not like that," she said quickly. "Mark and he's just a friend." "A friend?" I repeated, my disbelief palpable. "Since when do you laugh like that with just a friend? Since when do you hide just a friend from me?" Danielle stepped forward, her hands outstretched as if to placate me. "Chris, please. You're jumping to conclusions." "Am I?" I snapped, my voice rising. "Because I found your messages, Danielle. I saw what you wrote to him. Can't wait? Same time tomorrow? What exactly couldn't you wait for?" Her face went pale, and for a moment, I thought she might faint. You went through my phone," she asked, her tone a mix of shock and accusation. "Don't turn this around on me," I said sharply. "You're the one sneaking around. You're the one meeting him behind my back." Danielle's shoulders slumped, and she sank onto the couch, burying her face in her hands. "It's not what you think," she murmured, her voice muffled. "Then what is it?" I demanded. "Because right now, it looks like my wife has been lying to me." She didn't answer right away, and the silence stretched between us, heavy and suffocating. Finally, she looked up, her eyes glistening with tears. "I was lonely," she said, her voice cracking. "You've been so distant lately, Chris. Always at work, always distracted." I felt invisible. I stared at her, my anger simmering just beneath the surface. "So your solution was to flirt with the delivery guy?" I asked, my tone dripping with sarcasm. "It wasn't like that," she insisted, her tears spilling over. "It started out innocent, just small talk when he dropped off packages. But then, I don't know, he paid attention to me. He made me feel seen." "Seen?" I repeated, my voice rising again. "I see you, Danielle. I've always seen you. But you—" I paused, shaking my head. "You decided that wasn't enough." She stood abruptly, her own anger flashing through her tears. "Don't act like this is all on me," she snapped. "You've been checked out for months, Chris. I'm not saying what I did was right, but don't pretend you're blameless." Her words hit like a slap, and for a moment, I couldn't breathe. Was she right? Had I been so focused on work, on providing for us, that I'd neglected the one thing that mattered most? But no, this wasn't about me. This was about her choices, her betrayal. You had other options, Danielle, I said, my voice low and firm. You could have talked to me. You could have told me how you felt. But instead, you lied. You let some random guy into our lives, into our home. I know, she whispered, her shoulders shaking. I know I messed up. I didn't know how to fix it. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The weight of everything unsaid hung heavy between us, a chasm that felt too wide to bridge. I wanted to believe her, to see the woman I'd fallen in love with beneath the tears and excuses. But all I could see was the betrayal. That night, I couldn't bring myself to sleep in our bed. Instead, I grabbed a pillow and blanket and retreated to the guest room. The walls felt like they were closing in, the silence oppressive as I lay awake, staring at the ceiling. My mind raced with questions, each one more painful than the last. How had it come to this? Could we ever move past it? Did I even want to? The next morning, Danielle was already in the kitchen when I came downstairs. She looked up as I entered, her eyes red-rimmed from crying. "Chris," she began hesitantly, "can we talk?" I shook my head, grabbing a mug and pouring myself some coffee. "I don't have anything to say right now." "But I do," she pressed. "Please, just hear me out." Reluctantly, I sat at the table, my arms crossed as I waited for her to speak. "I know I've broken your trust," she said, her voice trembling, "and I don't expect you to forgive me overnight. But I love you, Chris. I always have. And I'm willing to do whatever it takes to fix this." Her words tugged at something deep inside me, but I wasn't ready to let her off the hook. "Love isn't enough, Danielle," I said coldly. "Not when you've lied to me. Not when you've made me question everything I thought I knew about us." She nodded, her tears falling silently. "I know, and I'll spend the rest of my life making it up to you if I have to. Just please don't give up on us." I wanted to believe her, to hold on to the hope that we could somehow rebuild what we'd lost. But the wounds were still fresh, the pain too raw. "I need time," I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. "I can't make any promises, but I'll try." Danielle nodded, her sobs breaking the silence as she buried her face in her hands. I stood, unable to bear the sight of her pain any longer, and left the room. As I retreated to the guest room, I felt the weight of everything pressing down on me. The road ahead was uncertain, filled with questions I didn't yet have answers to. But one thing was clear: nothing would ever be the same. The next few days passed in a haze of strained silence and half-hearted attempts at normalcy. Danielle tiptoed around me, her every move cautious, as if she were afraid of setting me off. I could see the effort in her gestures, the way she made my favorite coffee in the mornings, the way she lingered a little longer when she kissed me goodnight. But none of it felt real. None of it felt enough. For my part, I avoided her as much as possible. I left early for work and stayed late, throwing myself into projects just to escape the suffocating tension at home. But no matter how much I tried to distract myself, her words kept echoing in my mind. I felt invisible. Was I really that blind? Had I been so wrapped up in my own life that I'd missed the signs? It was easier to blame her, to hold on to the anger and betrayal, but the truth gnawed at me. Maybe I wasn't as innocent as I wanted to believe. One evening, as I sat alone in the guest room, scrolling mindlessly through my phone, a notification from Danielle's social media popped up. It was a photo of us from last year, a candid shot taken during a trip to the mountains. We were smiling, arms wrapped around each other, the kind of happiness that felt like a distant memory now. Her caption read, "Sometimes you don't realize how much you've taken for granted until it's almost gone. #grateful #working in it." I stared at the photo for a long time, my emotions a tangled mess. Part of me wanted to reach out to her, to tell her that I wasn't ready to give up either. But another part of me, the part that still ached from her betrayal, held back. Was it worth trying to fix what was so clearly broken? Or were we just delaying the inevitable? The question lingered as I finally set my phone down and turned off the light, the darkness offering little comfort. The next morning, I woke to the sound of my phone buzzing on the nightstand. It was a text from Alex. "Alex, need to meet. Something's come up about Danielle's delivery guy." My stomach twisted as I read the message. Alex had been keeping an eye on things since I first reached out to him, but I hadn't expected any new developments. I quickly texted back, agreeing to meet him at a nearby coffee shop. When I arrived, Alex was already there, a folder in front of him. He looked up as I sat down, his expression grim. "Tell me," I said, bracing myself. Alex slid the folder across the table. "You were right to be suspicious," he said. "Mark isn't just a delivery guy. He's been using his job as a cover too well. Let's just say he has a habit of getting too involved with his customers." I opened the folder, my eyes scanning the documents inside. There were photos of Mark with other women, some laughing with him, others looking far too familiar. There were also records showing visits to multiple addresses, including Danielle's, all outside of normal delivery hours. "He's a serial manipulator," Alex continued. "He preys on vulnerable women, gains their trust, and then moves on when things get too complicated." I clenched my fists, my anger bubbling to the surface. So what? Danielle was just another one of his conquests? Alex hesitated before nodding. "It looks that way. I know this doesn't excuse what she did, but it might explain some of it." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. Danielle wasn't innocent. Far from it. But had she been manipulated into making choices she wouldn't have otherwise? The thought didn't make her betrayal any less painful, but it added a layer of complexity I hadn't been prepared for. When I returned home that evening, Danielle was in the kitchen, chopping vegetables for dinner. She looked up when I walked in, her expression a mix of hope and apprehension. "Hey," she said softly. "How was your day?" "Long," I replied, setting my bag down on the counter. "We need to talk." Her hands stilled, and she set the knife down, wiping her hands on a dish towel. "Okay," she said, her voice trembling slightly. I leaned against the counter, crossing my arms. "I spoke to Alex today. He found some things about Mark." Her face paled, and she gripped the edge of the counter for support. What kind of things?" I hesitated, searching her face for any sign of deceit. "He's been doing this to other women," I said finally, "using his job to get close to them, to manipulate them." Danielle's breath hitched, and she covered her mouth with her hand. "I didn't know," she whispered. "I swear, Chris, I didn't know." "Didn't you?" I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. "You let him into our lives, Danielle. Into our home. And now I'm supposed to believe you had no idea?" Her tears spilled over, and she shook her head. "I was stupid," she choked out. "I was lonely and desperate, and I let myself believe he cared. But I never meant for it to go this far." Her words hit a nerve, and I felt my anger falter. As much as I wanted to hold onto my rage, I couldn't ignore the pain in her voice, the regret that seemed all too real. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice barely audible. I sighed, running a hand through my hair. "I don't know," I admitted. "But it's not something we can fix overnight." She nodded, her shoulders slumping. "I'll do whatever it takes," she said. "Just tell me what you need." "I need time," I said firmly. "And I need you to be honest with me from now on. No more lies. No more secrets." Danielle wiped her tears and nodded again. "Okay," she said. "You have my word." That night, I lay awake once again, the weight of everything pressing down on me. The road ahead was unclear, filled with questions and doubts. But for the first time in weeks, I felt a glimmer of something I hadn't allowed myself to feel before. Hope. It wasn't forgiveness. Not yet. But it was a start. The following days were a slow, painful crawl toward clarity. Danielle and I moved around each other like ghosts, speaking only when necessary, our conversations stripped down to essentials. Yet, even in the silence, the weight of what Alex had uncovered hung heavily between us. Danielle seemed different, more subdued. She spent most of her time cleaning or sitting quietly in the living room, flipping through old photo albums. Once, I walked past her and saw her staring at a picture of us from our honeymoon. Her fingers traced the edges of the photo, and for a fleeting moment, I felt the tug of nostalgia. But it wasn't enough to erase the hurt. One evening, I decided I needed answers, real answers. I couldn't move forward without understanding the full scope of what had happened. As much as it pained me, I knew it was time to confront her directly. After dinner, I sat across from her at the table, my hands clasped tightly in front of me. Danielle, I began, my voice steady but firm. I need to know everything. No half-truths. No omissions. Just the full story. She looked up from her plate, her eyes wide with trepidation. I've already told you. Not everything, I interrupted. I need to know how it started, why it happened, and how far it went. If we're ever going to have a chance at fixing this, I need to know the truth. Danielle's shoulders slumped, and she let out a shaky breath. Okay, she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. You deserve to know. She began hesitantly, her words slow and measured. It started a few months ago, she said. At first, it was nothing. Just friendly conversation when he dropped off packages. But then, he started staying longer, asking about my day, complimenting me. Her voice broke, and she looked down at her hands. I didn't mean for it to happen, Chris. I swear. But I was lonely. You were always so busy, and I felt like I didn't matter anymore. So you turned to him? I asked, my tone sharper than I intended. You let some stranger fill the gaps instead of coming to me? I didn't think you'd care, she said, her tears spilling over. You were always so distant. I thought you'd stop loving me. Her words hit like a punch to the gut, but I forced myself to stay calm. How far did it go? I asked, my voice cold. Danielle hesitated, her lip trembling. We kissed, she admitted. A few times. But that's all. I swear, Chris, it never went beyond that. I stared at her, searching her face for any sign of deception. Her confession hurt, but it also felt incomplete. And the messages? The ones I found on your phone? Her face crumpled, and she buried her head in her hands. I got caught up in it, she sobbed. The attention, the excitement. It was stupid and reckless, and I hate myself for it. I leaned back in my chair, the air feeling heavy around me. Do you understand what you've done? I asked quietly. You didn't just betray me. You put our entire marriage at risk for what? A fleeting moment of attention? I know, she said, her voice breaking. I know I hurt you, and I'll never forgive myself for it. But Chris, I want to make this right. I'll do whatever it takes. Her words felt sincere, but sincerity wasn't enough. Not now. It's not that simple, I said. Trust isn't something you can rebuild overnight. And right now, I don't even know if I want to try. The room fell silent, her sobs the only sound. I stood, unable to bear the sight of her pain any longer, and retreated to the guest room. As I closed the door behind me, I felt a wave of exhaustion wash over me. The confrontation had drained me, but at least now I had the answers I needed. The next day, I called Alex and told him to stop digging. I have enough, I said. I need to deal with this on my own now. Alex didn't argue, but his parting words stayed with me. Take care of yourself, Chris. Whatever you decide, make sure it's what's best for you. In the weeks that followed, Danielle and I settled into an uneasy truce. She threw herself into rebuilding my trust, making grand gestures of apology and small acts of kindness. She left handwritten notes on my nightstand, apologizing for her mistakes. She suggested therapy, a step I reluctantly agreed to take. Our first session was awkward, the air thick with unspoken tension. The therapist asked us to share what we wanted from the process, and our answers couldn't have been more different. Danielle wanted forgiveness. I wanted clarity. I need to understand why this happened, I said, because right now, it feels like everything we built together was a lie. It wasn't, Danielle insisted, her voice trembling. I love you, Chris. I never stopped. Her words sounded genuine, but I couldn't ignore the lingering doubt in my mind. The therapist encouraged us to take things one step at a time, to focus on rebuilding communication before addressing the deeper wounds. It was sound advice, but the road ahead felt daunting. At home, I started reclaiming pieces of my life that had been overshadowed by the betrayal. I spent more time with friends, threw myself into hobbies I'd abandoned, and focused on finding joy outside of my marriage. It wasn't about punishing Danielle. It was about rediscovering myself. One evening, as I worked on a project in the garage, Danielle appeared in the doorway. She looked hesitant, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. Can I talk to you? She asked softly. I set down my tools and nodded. What is it? I want to thank you, she said, her voice trembling, for giving me a chance. I know I don't deserve it, but I'm so grateful. Her words caught me off guard, and for a moment, I didn't know how to respond. It's not about deserving, I said finally. It's about figuring out if there's anything worth saving. And do you think there is? She asked, her eyes searching mine. I don't know yet, I admitted, but I'm willing to find out. It wasn't a resolution, but it was a start. And for now, that was enough. The days blurred together in a haze of tentative steps toward reconciliation. Danielle was trying. There was no doubt about that. She was present in ways she hadn't been in years, offering to cook dinner, initiating conversations, and making an effort to engage with the parts of my life she'd once ignored. But every smile, every kind word, felt tainted by the shadow of what had happened. Trust, I realized, wasn't something you could rebuild with grand gestures or heartfelt apologies. It was in the small moments, the consistency, the honesty, the effort over time. And while Danielle was giving it her all, I still wasn't sure if I could meet her halfway. One evening, as we sat across from each other at the dining table, Danielle broke the silence. Chris, she began, her voice soft but steady, I've been thinking about us, about what happened. I set down my fork, bracing myself. And I know I've hurt you, she said, her eyes glistening. But I also know that I want to fix this. I want us to work. Her words were earnest, but they didn't ease the knot in my chest. It's not just about wanting it to work, I said. It's about proving that it can. I know, she said quickly. That's why I've been researching retreats. For couples, I mean. A place where we can focus on us without all the distractions. I raised an eyebrow. You think a weekend getaway is going to solve our problems? No, she admitted, her hands twisting nervously, but I think it could help us reconnect. To remember why we fell in love in the first place. Her suggestion caught me off guard. The idea of leaving behind the daily grind, of focusing solely on us, was tempting. But it also felt risky. What if it didn't help? What if it only made things worse? I'll think about it, I said finally, not committing one way or the other. Danielle nodded, her shoulders relaxing slightly. That's all I ask. The next day, I found myself scrolling through the retreat options Danielle had emailed me. One stood out, a secluded cabin in the mountains, far from the noise and chaos of the city. The idea of getting away, of stripping everything down to just the two of us, felt both daunting and necessary. That evening, I told Danielle I was willing to give it a shot. Her face lit up with a mixture of relief and gratitude, and for the first time in weeks, I felt a flicker of hope. We arrived at the cabin on a crisp Friday afternoon. The air was cool and clean, the kind that made you want to take deep breaths just to savor it. The cabin itself was simple but cozy, with a roaring fireplace and large windows that overlooked the surrounding forest. This is nice, I said as I set our bags down. Danielle smiled, her expression tentative. I thought it might be good for us. We spent the first evening settling in, cooking dinner together and talking about the little things. Work, hobbies, memories of trips we'd taken in the past. It wasn't groundbreaking, but it was comfortable. And after weeks of tension, that felt like progress. The next morning, we went for a hike. The crisp autumn air invigorating as we made our way through the forest. Danielle was quieter than usual, her gaze often drifting to the ground. I waited, sensing she had something on her mind. Finally, she spoke. Chris, can I ask you something? Sure, I said, glancing at her. Do you still love me? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Her question stopped me in my tracks. I turned to face her, my heart pounding. Why are you asking me that? Because I need to know, she said, her eyes glistening with tears. I know I've broken your trust, and I know I don't deserve your love. But I need to know if there's still something worth fighting for. I hesitated, the weight of her question pressing down on me. I don't know, I said finally, my voice raw. I want to. I really do. But right now, I'm still trying to figure out if I can. Her tears spilled over, but she nodded. That's fair, she said softly. I needed to hear it. The rest of the hike was quiet, the tension between us palpable. But in a strange way, her question, and my answer, felt like a step forward. It was honest, even if it wasn't what either of us wanted to hear. That evening, as we sat by the fire, Danielle handed me a small notebook. "What's this?" I asked. "It's a journal," she said. "I've been writing in it every day since everything happened. I thought maybe it would help you understand where I've been, what I've been feeling." I opened the notebook, my fingers trembling slightly. The pages were filled with messy handwriting, each entry a window into her thoughts and regrets. As I read, I felt a mix of emotions, anger, sadness, but also a strange sense of connection. For the first time, I saw the depth of her pain and the sincerity of her efforts to make amends. By the time we left the cabin, something had shifted between us. The wounds were still there, raw and tender, but the walls we'd built around ourselves had begun to crumble. For the first time, I felt like we were both fighting for the same thing. When we returned home, life didn't magically fix itself. There were still arguments, still moments of doubt and frustration, but there was also a sense of determination, a shared commitment to rebuild what had been broken. One evening, as we sat on the porch watching the sunset, Danielle reached for my hand. "Thank you," she said quietly. "For what?" I asked. "For not giving up on me," she said. "On us." I squeezed her hand, my heart heavy but hopeful. "We're not there yet," I said, "but I'm willing to keep trying." And for the first time in a long time, I believed it. The weeks that followed our retreat felt like a cautious dance, two people learning how to move together again after stepping on each other's toes for far too long. Danielle's efforts didn't wane. If anything, they intensified. She was deliberate about showing up, not just in grand gestures but in the little things. Making my coffee just the way I liked it, sitting with me in the evenings even when I didn't say much, and leaving notes on the fridge with small reminders of the good moments we'd shared. At first, it felt like overcompensation, a desperate bid to erase her mistakes. But over time, it began to feel genuine. And slowly, I found myself softening, not forgiving, not yet, but opening up in ways I hadn't expected. One evening, as we sat on the couch, Danielle broke the silence. "I've been thinking about what's next for us," she said, her voice hesitant. "What do you mean?" I asked, setting down the book I'd been pretending to read. "I mean what we want our lives to look like," she said. "I know things aren't perfect, and I know I still have a lot to prove. But I want us to dream again, to think about the future." Her words caught me off guard. The future was something I hadn't allowed myself to consider. Not since the betrayal. My focus had been on survival, on getting through each day without letting the weight of it crush me. "I don't know," I admitted. "I'm still figuring out the present." Danielle nodded, her expression thoughtful. "Maybe we can figure it out together," she said. "One step at a time." That conversation marked a turning point. For the first time, we weren't just looking backward, dissecting the hurt and the mistakes. We were looking forward, even if only tentatively. We started making small plans, weekend trips, dinners with friends, and projects around the house. Each plan felt like a tiny victory, a reminder that life could still move forward, even in the shadow of everything we'd been through. One afternoon, as I cleaned out the garage, I came across a box of old photos. Most of them were from our early years together. Pictures from vacations, family gatherings, and quiet moments at home. I flipped through them, feeling a strange mix of nostalgia and sadness. "Find something interesting?" Danielle's voice broke through my thoughts. I turned to see her standing in the doorway, her hands tucked into the pockets of her jeans. "Just some old photos," I said, holding one up. It was a picture of us on our honeymoon, standing on a beach at sunset. She stepped closer, her gaze softening as she looked at the photo. "I remember that day," she said. "We were so happy." "We were," I agreed, my voice quiet. Danielle hesitated for a moment before speaking. "Do you think we can get back to that? To being happy?" I looked at her, the weight of her question settling heavily in my chest. "I think we can try," I said finally, "but it's going to take time." "I'm willing to wait," she said, her voice steady, "for as long as it takes." The months passed, and the wounds began to heal. Not completely, but enough that they no longer felt like open sores. Therapy helped, as did the consistency of Danielle's efforts. I started to trust her again, though cautiously, and we found ourselves laughing more, talking more, and slowly rebuilding the connection we'd lost. But even as we moved forward, I knew there were things I couldn't forget. The betrayal had left a mark, one that would never fully fade. And while I was learning to live with it, I also knew that our marriage would never be the same. One evening, as we sat on the porch watching the sunset, Danielle reached for my hand. "Thank you," she said quietly. "For what?" I asked. "For giving us a second chance," she said. "I know I don't deserve it, but I'm so grateful." I looked at her, my heart heavy but hopeful. "We're not there yet," I said, "but we're getting closer." She nodded, her eyes glistening. "I'll keep fighting for us," she said, "every day." "And I'll keep trying," I replied. In the end, our story wasn't about perfection. It wasn't about erasing the past or pretending the hurt hadn't happened. It was about learning to live with the imperfections, to find beauty in the broken pieces, and to build something stronger from the rubble. Life moved on, and so did we, imperfectly, but together. And for the first time in a long time, that felt like enough.